On the topic of training to failure, it's something we wanted to explore a little bit because just to zoom out, uh, part of our purpose on this podcast is really
Mm,
to try and reconcile evidence-based training or what that kind
yeah,
of means because it's really been bastardized a little bit online. Uh,
yeah.
Over the last couple of years, everyone claims to be evidence-based with, you know, no real education or not much education, and you have people kind of like the old school bodybuilders who are very much like almost anti evidence based now because of that. And there's a bit of a shift here.
Swing to
Um,
extremes, always.
yeah, exactly. So on the topic of reps and reserve, a lot of the papers coming out now are suggesting that training 1 to 2 reps away from failure would offer similar hypertrophy gains to failure with
Mm.
less fatigue. So some would suggest that might be a more sustainable way of training, but I personally am not, I don't know how I feel about this because bodybuilders all throughout time, the most successful ones were always training to failure and beyond failure. So, how do you reconcile this research and how do you implement it into your training with yourself and clientele?
I will say as a start, um, I appreciate, respect, and understand the concept of purposely leaving reps in reserve. I mean, the concept here is that we're going to accumulate fatigue in both the peripheral and central fraction. Peripheral fatigue is often associated with peripheral stimulus. Good. Central fatigue limits peripheral fatigue slash stimulus accrual. Not so good. So what can we do to limit central fatigue so we can accumulate more net peripheral stimulus? And the theory states that, okay, we need to train in close proximity to failure to facilitate the accrual of hypertrophy stimulus. And there appears to be a diminished, possibly at least, a diminished return in terms of peripheral stimulus when we go from, say, 3 reps or 2 reps from reserve to 0. But there's a disproportionate increase in central fatigue due to the big cardiometabolic response. So why not pull back a little bit? Maybe we get more out. And I think that might be a sound thing. Maybe. Okay. But there's probably a couple of problems here. Is one is when you start to, we've seen this, okay, where individuals taking this at face value is that training to failure is not good. And I'm gonna say, well, if you haven't had exposure to failure, you can't judge proximity to failure. And therefore I believe we had a big lull there where individuals, I mean, I'm speaking broadly here, but those in the evidence-based realm, or more than anything, those of whom claimed evidence-based that didn't have a background in scientific, a formal background in science, end up training with not enough intensity. And that's problematic, right? Um, so I get, this has its place. But yes, and on the other hand, if we look at yes in anecdote, which is a poor form of evidence, but the best bodybuilders in the world were all about trying to find ways to train harder, not easier. So there's a bit of a midway here. And I suppose from a practical perspective, I acknowledge that training harder always is not always the answer. But I believe that most individuals, this is a belief system here, because we look at Martin Raffaello's work, he would indicate that most people are really good at evaluating proximity to failure. I love Martin's work. It's a bit conflicting with other research, but at least in that sample, they're really good at judging proximity to failure. In my experience, people are not overly great at judging proximity to failure. And the way I like to use reps in reserve is instead of using it as a means of pulling back, I would use it as a means of auditing intensity. Did I have another repetition if I'm in a hard section of training, I did. Okay, there's a little bit more I can ring out for next time. So I don't know if I answered your question then, if I didn't, fill me in.
Yeah. And Martin, on the topic of Martin Ruffalo, he had a study in 2024 that did look
Mm,
at the differences in hypertrophy between 1 to 2 and failure. And
yeah,
his study and a lot of other studies, I think one of the limitations is that they're over like 8 weeks. And we know
sensitivity,
that
right?
hypertrophy is a slow process. So,
Mm,
and it's hard to really accurately assess hypertrophy over like 6 months. Um,
yeah.
so could that be playing into it? If we were able to look at hypertrophy over 12 months, 1 to 2 reps from reserve versus failure, maybe we'd see more of a difference in hypertrophy there.
It's plausible. I mean, realistically, any any paper has methodological limitations. Unfortunately, in everything that we look at in sports science, the samples are tiny. So my wife fiance rather, who does research in the medical field. I mean, she looks at some of the research, like, what? You got 40 participants. I'm like, honey, this is fantastic. She's like, we wouldn't do anything less than like several hundred. We need more statistical power to really pull out something decent. And like, yeah, most of the studies that we look at are really underpowered. And yes, there's limitations with duration as well. And if you've conducted research, you'll know how bloody hard it is to get participants, A, and B, when you're looking at lab-based, or at least studies that require the level of supervision, when you're looking at RPE, and obviously you need a lab to evaluate these outcome measures, it is damn expensive. So it's huge burden on the research, on the participant. So yes, there's major methodological limitations there. I know doctors Zach also did some research, also collaborated with Martin as well. His paper tends to indicate that there might be positive benefit with training in closer proximity to failure, but he's the first to put forth the potential limitations in his methods as well. So right now, I suppose we're in this mid ground where, you know, we can draw, I suppose, both directions from the research to a degree. But I believe when it comes to being evidence-based, right, you got to get back to the fundamental definition of evidence-based. It's essentially three components merging together: best research, a logical understanding, so mechanisms, and then looking at the person in front of you. And you may have an individual of whom is able to train very frequently to failure, possibly beyond it. I've worked with some individuals that frequently train beyond failure, you know, force negatives of 3 on every single set. And it's like, man, I'm breaking with that. But if they respond incredibly well to it, they're well acclimated to it, because you will acclimate to your training intensity to a degree. And managing recovery, we'll say, fantastic. This might be an appropriate recommendation for that individual. There might be other individuals where it's not suitable. So, you know, we have to personalize there. But it's an interesting spot that we're in right now on that side of things.
Doubling down on that concept of recovery when it comes to training intensities and hypertrophy. In that paper that Hayden just alluded to, Rafalo 2024, which is a very recent paper, they found in that particular study that there was greater neuromuscular fatigue with the group that trained to failure. So I guess when you consider that, would you say that, you know, training with 1 to 2 reps in reserve and training to failure, one of the major overarching differences, just to simplify things for the listeners, would be related to the ability to accrue volume of training over time due to that, I guess, central fatigue that you would develop?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of argument, is that there comes a point where there's a diminished return on stimulus accrual at the tissues you want, at the peripheral tissues, and a disproportionate increase in central fatigue. So that's the argument for holding back a little bit.
Yeah.
And like I said, I sort of am somewhat in the middle here. I will say this: I have personal biases, as does anyone. I have a bias towards intensity. I want to say that from the get-go. It's important to acknowledge this. I have a bias towards intensity, primarily as a product of the era that I came up in and the mentors that I had. Mentors that I had certainly pushed intensity. And through my process of bodybuilding, I have learned to train harder. And I've always endeavored to learn how to train harder, because there is just so many levels to that. And I do acknowledge the rationale behind pulling back on occasion. And I believe this, just because, so I believe that intensity is one lever. There are times where you want to pull back, okay? But there's also times where it's very appropriate to hit the intensity lever and go. Where things get a bit opaque is with the interpretation that we should never train a failure. And that's something that I have a problem with, where I'd say, hey, the actual research doesn't say this. This is a matter of interpretation from someone of whom is unscientific with their thinking and taking research at face value.